Welcome to The Edges of Lean. I'm Bella Engelbach, and in this podcast, we explore the human and creative side of lean thinking, unusual places where lean thinking is practiced. We meet people who are practicing continuous improvement in many different flavors and styles. So come along with me on a journey to the edges of lean.
Episode 31. Continuous Improvement and Overcoming Imposter Syndrome. My guest is Tara Halliday. Tara has been a holistic therapist and coach for over 21 years, and she's a specialist in imposter syndrome. She is the author of the Amazon #1 bestseller, Unmasking, the Coach's Guide to Imposter Syndrome, and she's the creator of the Inner Success 8-week program for executives to eliminate imposter syndrome and get back to being great. Tara Halliday, welcome to the Edges of Lean.
Thank you very much, Bella. Lovely to be here.
It's really nice to have you here today. I have been thinking about imposter syndrome for a long time because in my own career, I moved from one job to another job in different types of industries. And I always felt that I was not quite the person that should be doing those jobs. And I was, in a way, gratified to find out that I was not the only person who ever felt that way. But when you talk about imposter syndrome, it's more than that feeling of just being uncertain, I expect. But before we get into that, what I would love you to do is tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you get into this field?
Well, the solution to that is I was following a thread of continuous improvement. So that's quite interesting. So I started trained as a holistic therapist and coach 21 years ago. And I worked just in general with pretty much everybody. And I found that as I was doing that, most people were empowered, went away and, had good results and went on. Some people kept coming back. And that for me was an issue because that's not the point. The point is empowerment, not to become a continual crutch, if you like. So in investigating that, I discovered that it was really some beliefs that they were holding. So then my mission was to find, the underlying beliefs, which beliefs and how to change them. And I came across a particular kind of coaching all around worth, that our worth is unconditional, which was the goal, rather than conditional, which is what most people believe. It was very powerful. I went through it myself. I trained in it and started getting some really deep and excellent results with clients. And then one of my clients mentioned imposter syndrome. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. I'll have to research this, find out what that is. And it was just so clear when I found out, imposter syndrome, it's the secret feeling of being a fraud or not good enough or that you don't quite belong when you're not. So it's a gap between your actual abilities and your own perception of how well you're doing. And when I explored imposter syndrome, did some research on it, it was just so clear to me that the driver of imposter syndrome was this belief in our conditional worth. So then I did a whole bunch more research, interviews. I wrote an Amazon best-selling book, Unmasking, the Coach's Guide to Imposter Syndrome. So this is for coaches. And that was going great. And then I got into some neuroscience. So I trained as a neurofeedback trainer where we had electrodes on your head measuring your brain waves as you're doing some belief change exercises. And doing that and then studying the explanation of why and how we are interacting with our brains when we change a belief, that led me to taking what was probably a 2-year coaching journey around worth and gave me the ability to condense it into a short 8-week program. And that's how I got to where I am now. So a whole bunch of threads all came together.
Did you ever feel imposter syndrome yourself?
So I didn't recognize imposter syndrome when I started my research. And then when I got more into it, there was one particular behavior with imposter syndrome, which is avoiding a promotion, avoiding a role. And that took me back to a time when I just graduated from university and I got offered a job by General Electric, but not the graduate trainee job that I'd applied for. But no, they'd done a Myers-Briggs test and personality test, and they wanted to put me on a fast track management position, and I was, oh no, I did not want that. And that was my imposter syndrome. And what happened was I told myself at the time, had no idea, I told myself at the time, oh, that sounds boring. That sounds boring. So I went back to university and I did a Ph.D. in engineering. So I have my PhD because of imposter syndrome. Now, so there was quite a nice outcome, but it illustrates nicely how much of a change and much of an impact it can have on people's careers, and sometimes in not a good way as well. So then the other question, do I get imposter syndrome now? I don't. I'm glad
you
to say
don't.
I don't. No. It doesn't mean things don't go wrong. I'm not saying that. And, I don't struggle, and we're always learning with things. But the idea that it's me, that there's something, I'm not good enough. If something goes wrong, that connection doesn't happen anymore. So that's the great thing.
It's very interesting when we think about the world of continuous improvement, because we always want people, and they say this, particularly people who are doing the improvement Carta, the Toyota Carta, they want people to be striving at the very edge of what they don't know, not to be out where you don't know anything, but to be just at the edge of what you don't know, so that you're always learning something new. But to get to that, you have to be able to be uncomfortable, or comfortable with being uncomfortable. What are your thoughts about that?
Yes. So if you look at it from the neuroscience point of view, so part of our brain is always trying to predict the future, predict what's going to happen next in order to keep us safe. And in order to, predict the future, it looks out for dangers. So it's looking more for tigers and snakes than the right kind of food. This is on a very primitive level. This is how our brains are set up. And so we have a natural disinclination to go somewhere that we might find scary. However, when we're in a very calm state, we have a natural impetus to stretch ourselves and grow. Yes, for example, I've just recently got into Sudoku. It's a little maths quiz game, and it's very logical. It's a lot of fun, and I did it for a while, and I got quite good at it. And then I ordered a book which said Extreme Sudoku, expecting it to be difficult, which was good, which was kind of at my level of challenge. And it turned out to be not. It was actually way too easy. So I was disappointed that it was too easy. And then to challenge myself or make it more interesting, I started trying to do them in my head rather than writing out the notes, which is right. So I gave myself additional level of challenge. And this is a very natural behavior that if we get good at something, we've got this impulse to master it. And so I love that's where you're going, getting to the edge of what you know, continuing to challenge that. That's a fabulous place to be when your brain doesn't think you're in imminent danger. When your brain thinks you're imminent danger and you go to the edge of whatever it is, it's predicting just more danger and you get more stress. So just depending on how you are feeling and connected with your nervous system on the inside depends on, how comfortable or not you are with that edge.
When people are feeling imposter syndrome, and you said earlier, it's about that difference between your ability or your worth in a certain situation and the actual situation, right? So you might, if you in my situation, if I was suddenly asked to be in the Olympics as an ice skater and I can barely skate, that would not be imposter syndrome, right? That would be make sense. It would not make sense for me to do that. In the world that we're in now, I feel that we're always being thrust into something new. And I wonder, are there people who are sort of naturally better suited to that? And as opposed to people who either because of, and you can tell us because of their upbringing or just because of their way, their brain are wired, are always going to feel uncomfortable or would need to work to not feel uncomfortable.
It really depends on, as you say, how the brain is wired. But I'd say patterned rather than wired, because the brain has this neuroplasticity. It's able to change. And so it's just the pattern that you've used and adopted and got so far. Basically, your brain creates a model of your whole environment in order to predict it. And in that, there are things that are labeled danger. Right? And there's a part in your brain called the amygdala, which is on both sides, that checks to see if any of your surrounding is triggering any of that danger, if there's any danger around us immediately. And when it does that, then we get into this stress situation. It triggers the nervous system into fight, flight, and freeze. Decisions become more difficult. Our focus narrows. When we're less creative. Our IQ drops by 13 points when we're in this. So we literally do not have the resources to perform at the level that we want to. So this is what happens when your brain is triggered. And one of the triggers is a belief in your worth, and that's imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome is the symptom of your brain identifying that this situation is going to A, prove that I'm not good enough, or B, people are going to find me out and throw me out the tribe and I'm going to die. So that's kind of the brain's inflammation of the situation. And so in order to change that, what we need to do is change the belief that's triggering the amygdala in the first place. So it's all changeable, all neuroplasticity.
And at least from what I know about what the amygdala retains, not everything the amygdala retains is true, right? It could be an interpretation of a situation. Absolutely. As opposed to an actual situation. And so what you are reacting to may not even really be a danger. It's a belief that has been retained that way. So is this? Yeah.
And the belief about our worth from imposter syndrome is one that we form between the ages of 18 months and 3 years old. So very, very old, very deep identity level belief, it's called, because it's who we think we are. And it's essentially when a child is very, very young, a baby, they have no, in terms of the model of the world, no distinction, no separation between them and their environment. So, them doing something bad means they are bad. Right? And if them doing something good means they are good. They got no separation. As they go through 18 months to 3 years, they get this separate idea of separation of themselves. But if they're not taught that there's a difference between who they are and what they do, then they continue that as a belief, because it's, that map of the world, that model hasn't been updated with this new information about what it means to be a separate human being. This is why 99.9999% of people have this idea, have this belief that my worth depends on what I do.
Which is why when somebody asks you, what do? You answer with the most spectacular part of your career that you could possibly explain, or your parenting, or where you live or something to show your worth.
Exactly, to try and prove it. And this is why some people overwork, over-prepare. I mean, imposter syndrome is a symptom of that belief, and that it shows up in high achievers when they're trying to stretch themselves and challenge themselves. If you were doing a very routine job day in, day out, year after year, you wouldn't have that, edge of challenging yourself. So you'd be less likely to come across imposter syndrome.
Right. But growth comes from the challenge. So
yeah. Growth comes from and I'd say that the joy comes from the challenge as well. The adventure of it, the excitement, doing the Sudoku in your head because it'd just be too boring to do this easy Sudoku in front of you. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So what you're saying is that there's a neuroscientific explanation for it, but part of it is also, it's not just nature, it's nurture as well. Is that, and I would hate, but it's not necessarily, if I could just probe on that a little bit more, it's not necessarily that, you said a child should be taught this. How might a child be taught the difference between what they do and their worth?
That would require their parents pointing out the difference. So the action that you did, right, is don't put your hand in the fire. The action that you did is dangerous, or there's a disapproval of the action, but not a disapproval of the child. That's the difference. But most people don't have that role model example from their own parents because they had the same belief and their parents had the same belief, So unless you actually specifically go looking for ways in which to teach your children this difference, then you just won't. And the child will then have to figure it out for themselves later on. Yeah.
So it's very difficult we actually cannot go back and undo what was done to us when we were 18 months old. So when an adult is in that situation of having imposter syndrome, what are the kinds of things that they typically do to address it?
Well, there are things that people try, because I think that there's a misunderstanding about what it is. So one of the myths is that imposter syndrome is a lack of confidence, where it's absolutely not a lack of confidence. It's a sense of feeling in the moment that I'm not quite good enough. And, people with imposter syndrome, and my clients are, C-level executives, CEOs, directors, they're right at the top of their game. And they know, if you ask them intellectually, yes, they're competent, they're capable, and for the most part, confident. However, at the same time, they've got this internal feeling, this nagging feeling that they're not quite good enough. And that causes the stress. It causes the amygdala to get into the fight, flight, and freeze state, and then to, lose their 13 points of IQ. So it just makes everything much, much, much harder.
So then if they think it's about confidence, then they might try to do activities that would build confidence. They might surround themselves with people who act as if they have confidence in them, which would be a shame, I think, if you're a C-level executive and you surround yourself with people who are always acting as if they have confidence in you, because then you might not hear some of the things that you probably should be hearing.
Yeah. And honestly, it wouldn't make a difference anyway. There's several classic imposter syndrome behaviors, and one of them is to deflect praise because you simply don't believe it, because you think the other person doesn't see you clearly enough, and they're over exaggerating. So surrounding yourself with people who are just saying yes and you're wonderful actually doesn't help.
That doesn't help. Doesn't help.
It can actually make things worse because it makes you feel less seen, less understood, more isolated, more like you don't belong, and actually make it make the imposter syndrome worse. So that's one thing. The other thing is, people try some mindset techniques. There's NLP techniques, and there's
NLP is neuro-linguistic programming.
Yeah. So they try that. They try affirmations. Standing in front of the mirror and telling themselves, even I've heard one which is "I am enough. I am enough." Right, and you're repeating it over and over. There's a good reason why that works in certain circumstances, a neuroscience reason for why it works. But when you have the belief that you're not quite enough, then the belief wins. And so, it's like your brain saying, I don't believe you. No, isn't. And it doesn't work. And so a lot of people struggle because they think they can talk themselves out of a belief. And you can't. It needs a very specific process that goes through and changes the pattern that the amygdala is recognizing. And unless you do that process, you're not going to change the belief.
So it's actually, in a way, resetting the amygdala or tuning it differently so that it's not reacting the way that it used to.
Yes, but in very specific circumstances, because if you just took your amygdala and just dialed down its sensitivity, then you'd stop reacting in situations where there's a car coming towards you or there's a ball flying towards your head. So it's not about dialing it down. It's just taking those incidents that are not supportive and are not, as you say, not true, right? They're these false beliefs and replacing them with a real self-acceptance is the answer to it. It's that self-acceptance. I am as I am, and my worth does not depend on what I do. But you can't just talk yourself.
You can't just keep saying that to yourself.
No.
That's really fascinating, Tara, because I think certainly in the coaching profession, there's a lot of reliance on neuro-linguistic programming. I would say not so much in my field, which is leading to continuous improvement, but certainly in other coaching environments, there's a lot of reliance on that and a lot of reliance on, listening to the affirmations, writing them down, putting them on the mirror in the bathroom, things like that. And frankly, I've always been a bit skeptical of it because I think that in order to change a belief, the best way that I know is to sort of behave yourself into that belief. You can't sort of talk yourself into it. Even
that's not necessarily, because if your belief is your brain's model of the world, and it's precious, right? It's keeping you safe, and it doesn't. And some of the deep ones like this, it doesn't want to change because you've got layered on top of it. There's something the brain does called confirmation bias. So anytime there's a situation that reinforces a belief, it gets layered on top. So you've got this layer upon layer of confirming situations. And this is why these, deep level identity level beliefs are so hard to change. Now, Carl Jung, the very early psychologist, had this model of the world, which was the brain, rather, the mind, which was an iceberg, right? 10% on top of the surface is your conscious mind, 90% below the surface is the unconscious. So all those techniques that we were talking about, the NLP, the affirmations, the repetition, the journaling, things like that, they work very well at kind of surface level beliefs between the conscious and the unconscious. And so that's great, but the belief we're talking about with imposter syndrome is right at the very bottom of the iceberg. Right? It's identity level because we think it's who we are, and this is why it's such a surprise to people. I mean, it affects 70% of high achievers at some point in their career, which is a huge amount, but people keep it a secret because they think it's them. And then so they don't hear about that everybody else is feeling this way. So they feel even more that it's just them. And this is why it's so great to talk about it, because it's breaking that pattern, that cycle of secrecy, bringing it out into the open.
This reminds me of something that happened to me a few years ago. I met up with a friend of mine that actually not really a friend, more of an acquaintance that I had known in high school. I hadn't seen him for decades. And we talked about our experience in high school. And I had moved from the UK to the US at about the age of 9. And so I always felt in sort of US school culture, I didn't really get it because I was raised in a different school culture. And I always felt like I didn't belong. And I always felt like an outsider. Though I think if you sort of looked at me, you would say, well, she's an insider, but I felt like an outsider. And I was talking to this person that I had gone to high school with and told him about this. And he said, oh, I felt exactly the same way. And he said, I think everybody did. And it was so funny after decades to hear that, because I certainly would have picked out every situation where somebody had laughed at my accent or, not knowing what were the right clothes to wear as being, confirmation of the fact that I was an outsider. But of course, that was probably happening to everybody.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes, that's interesting. Yes. So what should people be doing then? And I don't want you to sort of give away your whole thing, but and I'm sure you don't want to either. But what is an approach that's better than trying to build your confidence or doing affirmations or?
Yeah, well, so there's two things you can do. One is to manage imposter syndrome, and the other is to get rid of it, basically.
Yeah.
And the getting rid of it is the work that I do, and that's the changing the belief through the repatterning of the amygdala in a very specific process based on the neuroscience that we're measuring the brainwaves. So that is. So it's possible, it's there, it's out there, it's available, but most people aren't going to do that. So what most people go do, the first one is to get some support. So this is managing it. So the imposter syndrome, I talked about people kind of feeling like it's just them, they don't belong, feeling very isolated. So finding somebody that there's, friendly, non-judgmental, not their boss, that they can talk to about it, not necessarily even about imposter syndrome, just what's going on in their lives. The other thing that can help is imposter syndrome gets triggered very often in situations where you have high challenge and low support. So what I was just describing was increasing that support. But if you realize that that's the pattern, then you can look out for it. So if you're going through a job transition, for example, or you're going to do something that's going to be a really big challenge, then make sure that you get as much help as you can. And people with imposter syndrome often don't ask for help, or they struggle with saying no, so they take on too much. Right? So anything you can do to ask for a bit of help. So those are the two things that can just help kind of dial down the stress and anxiety of it. I think it does help to know that 70% of people have it, so you're not alone. And I think just knowing that it's not you is very helpful as well.
So that is really interesting and helpful advice, Tara. And I think for a lot of people, just admitting to somebody else that they have this concern, or that they feel that perhaps they're not quite bright or in the right place, they might find that other people say, I feel that way too, right? That's right. And now you have an ally.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Creating an ally. Pick the ally very carefully, right? This isn't about standing on a box in the corner of the street shouting it out to the world. No, it's not that. But pick an ally that you'll be able to trust and have that conversation. And very often that person will respond, I had no idea. You always seem so confident. Yeah, it's a very, very common response to that kind of statement.
When a person hears that, does that then help them to hear, it's not showing on the outside, that you are still inspiring confidence or leadership or followership?
It might, but it's again, if it sounds a little like it's like any hint that it might be praise, then we could discount it. Right? So this is the confirmation bias. When we get something, that goes against what we believe, the belief that's underneath it, then we discount it. So this is what they're doing. They're like, oh no, yeah,
right.
Oh, you're just being nice.
Oh, yeah. I was wondering, Tara, about whether there were any gender differences with this, because as I shared with you before this podcast, I am involved in a very large group of women who are working in the business world, many of whom have struggled with imposter syndrome, or what they believe is imposter syndrome. And one of the reasons that women say that they feel it is because when they go out into environments such as LinkedIn, they see men making very confident statements about the world, or about a certain business practice, or about how things should be. And that has not, I think, helped some of the confidence of some of the women. But now I'm wondering if perhaps the men are out there doing this despite the fact that they also are feeling some level of imposter syndrome.
You have it exactly right. When the research was initially done, imposter syndrome was first identified back in 1978. Their group was female graduate students. And then the studies that were after that in the next 15 years or so seemed to show that women get it more than men. Right? That it's more of a women's issue. But then in the 1990s, there was a piece of research done where they took the survey and they made it absolutely, completely confidential and anonymous. And what happens is the men showed to be exactly the same levels of imposter syndrome as the women. There was no gender difference. And when you look at where the belief comes from, there's no gender difference in there either. So all these studies that said it's women more than men were actually just capturing the social tendency of women are more allowed to express feelings of weakness, and men are more not allowed to do so. And it was just capturing that gender bias in our social structure rather than what was really going on.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yes, absolutely fascinating. And I find that is quite to think that it's a women's issue. I think is harmful to both men and women, because harmful to women because it seems to be saying that there's something inherently wrong with being a woman in a business world. And that's absolutely not the case. And I think for men, it's harmful because if they think it's a women's issue and they have it, they feel even more isolated and even more alone. And it makes that sense of imposter syndrome worse. So, yeah. So when you say that you just notice that, some men are speaking up, that can be a way of trying to maybe convince everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you will see it, particularly as you get to these, senior leadership roles, you're more and more expected to be right all the time, not in technical sense, but just in what you say in the statements that you make. And what if you're not feeling that on the inside? What if you're feeling that self-doubt? What do you do? Some people hide, so hiding their opinions or not speaking up enough. And some people just kind of blag it, make it up, or just say it with enough authority that other people believe it's true. Right? So
whether or not they believe it themselves.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Halliday, you have a quiz you'd like to tell us about.
Yes, I have a free quiz. It's just 20 questions. It's actually the original research test that was done back in 1978. And so I'll give you the link, and people can go and take the test for free and see how imposter syndrome might be affecting them.
Right. So if you are watching this on YouTube, you'll see the link pop up on the screen at the end. It will also be in the show notes wherever you listen, if you're listening to this.
Lovely.
So yeah, so that quiz has really stood up then since the 70s as being a helpful way to it's a sort of self-diagnose, I suppose, or to.
Yeah, we'll see a lot of the question that people have is this imposter syndrome, or am I really not good enough? How is this something that I can do something about, or is this part of my personality? And it's not part of your personality. It's just that belief that's showing up as imposter syndrome, and it can be changed. But it measures the severity of what you're experiencing as well, and the more you can understand about it, the less you can know that it's not you, and I think that's very helpful.
And I think for people who are really working on expanding their horizons and learning things and doing experiments at that edge of their knowledge, knowing that as you're striving, if you're feeling that you're not quite good enough, you're not going to be getting it right, knowing that that's something that 70% of everybody else who's doing this is going to be feeling this too, I think is probably very comforting, right? I mean, it's good to know in a way that you're not alone in doing this. If it's hard for you, that's not because there's anything necessarily wrong with who you are.
Yes. That's exactly it. Yes.
Yeah. I usually ask, and I will ask you, Tara, what is your advice to young people starting their career? But I just wanted to go back to this topic because I'm thinking about people who are raising kids, and particularly people who have children in that very critical age. I think, you were saying it's between 18 months and 3 years. And 3 years is, I think, about as far back as most of us can remember, if we could even remember that, because there's a lot of neural pruning that happens then, right?
Yes.
So, but that's such an important time. What might be one or two things that parents could say or do to help their kids at that point, to help that toddler with the keep their amygdala tuned in a healthy fashion?
Yeah, there are quite a few things that you can do, probably more time than we have to go into.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you can do is, rather than passing judgment on something, like the child's done something, or they've come back and they're telling you, rather than passing judgment on them as being good or bad for doing it, right? Ask them instead, did you have fun? Yeah. What did you learn? Yeah. Things like that. What was your favorite part of this? What of this would you like to do again? And those are then questions that put the authority on the child and their opinion of themselves, and rather than being judged. Yeah. So you got 7 A's and a B. What did you like about that? What was the best part? Rather than good or bad, right? Good for the 7 A's or bad for the 1 B,
Wow. Yeah. And I'm thinking, as you're saying those things, those are also coaching questions, right? Those are questions that we would be asking an adult who's just gone through a situation. We'd ask them, well, what was good about that? What did you learn from it?
Yeah.
What might you might ask it, what might you do differently next time? What would be your next action? But But you would never say to an employee or to a coaching client, "Oh, you were a terrible person when you did that," right?
Well, you see, because people have no difference as adults between what they say and do and who they are. When you say that what you did was bad, they feel like they are bad, like they automatically go there. And so that's the separation you want to grow in the child.
To grow that separation between worth and action, because when no one's going to be perfect, no one's going to make the perfect action every single time.
That's it. But it doesn't change. It doesn't change their worth. It doesn't change, them being a worthwhile human being. Yeah.
And just to bring this back to lean thinking, in lean, we talk so much about respect for people, and we don't mean that in a light way. We mean that it's just in being in awe of how incredible human beings are. And we really want to respect every single person because we're in awe of their inherent brilliance as a human being. So that is absolutely wonderful advice, Tara. Yeah. So what is the advice that you would give to a young person starting their career?
Okay, so for a young person starting their career, they are going to go through that transition of learning when you're going from unconscious incompetence through to conscious competence, and understand that that's a path you're going to go through, right? And learning involves mistakes, and the mistakes don't mean you're bad. Yeah, so that's so where we're going is a level of self-acceptance in here. But if I could give one tip, one of the most common imposter syndrome behaviors is comparing ourselves to others, but particularly comparing how other people look like they're doing and comparing it to how you're feeling in the inside. So when we're doing, and that's the problem, because there's a gap. And so when you're doing the comparing, when you catch yourself comparing, realize that you're trying to look at the differences and see if when you're comparing, you can just shift that and look for the similarities between you and them. When you look for the similarities, then you'll feel more connected, you'll feel more like you belong, and life will be much easier.
That's amazing advice. Thank you, Tara.
Pleasure.
Tara, where can people find you?
So I post most on LinkedIn. So if we have a link in the show notes for my LinkedIn profile, that would be great. My website is completesuccess.co.uk, and my book Unmasking can be found on Amazon.
Terrific. Thank you so much for journeying with me to the edges of lean.
Absolute pleasure. It's been great. Thank you so much, Bella.
This is Bella Engelbach, and I'd like to thank Tara Halliday for being my guest on The Edges of Lean. Has Imposter Syndrome impacted your continuous improvement practice? We'd love to hear from you. Comments, feedback, and ratings are welcome and greatly appreciated wherever you watch or listen, or reach out to either one of us on LinkedIn. Please join me for more of The Edges of Lean. There's a lot to learn, and check out my friends in the Lean Communicators community at leancommunicators.com. You'll find helpful and educational new podcast and video content there every week. The Edges of Lean is written and produced by Bella Engelbach. This is a Lean for Humans production.